Huge icebergs are pulled to the thirstiest places on Earth. A fog-collecting beetle inspires a nation. A giant jellyfish bag tows fresh water through the ocean. A handy gadget that transforms salt water and saves sailors' lives. All of these ingenious, sometimes oddball schemes have been devised for one reason: to save mankind from an unthinkable disaster. Water, our most precious resource, the elixir of life, is in danger.
We're entering a future in which water's increasingly scarce.
We need to recognize that the resource is, in fact, finite, which it is.
There's still 1 billion people worldwide without clean drinking water, and 2.4 billion people don't have adequate sanitation services.
It will be our ingenuity and ability to adapt that will rescue humanity from a world water crisis that is gaining momentum. My name is Mark de Villiers. I've been many places in the world as a journalist, and I've experienced some of the worst and the best that humanity has to offer. When it comes to water, we're guilty of some serious crimes against nature. But at the same time, there are some very innovative people who are working to find solutions. Sometimes our inventors need look only to nature to find the most ingenious ways of doing things. For example, the simple idea of collecting condensed water vapor. Fog is airborne water that we can see. As one scientist put it, fog is simply a cloud on the ground. In most desert areas, there are no clouds all year round, but fog appears almost every morning. However, it is not an easy matter to extract water from this vapor. For ideas on how to go about it, scientists turn to, of all things, a beetle. This desert-dwelling insect survives by allowing condensation to occur on its wings. The captured moisture then trickles down grooves on its back to form droplets on its legs. Voila, enough water for this little creature's need. With the beetle as inspiration, serious efforts are being made to capture water from thin air. At this test site, a double layer of mesh is supported by a frame on a vertical plane. Depending on location and wind speed, 50 square meters of mesh can collect anywhere between 150 and 750 liters of drinkable water a day. The startup costs are small, the technology is simple, and it's sustainable. Take Namibia, for example. This is a very arid country with almost no surface water. Its aquifers have been depleted, and the water that is left has a high salt level. But Namibia does have a lot of fog rolling in from its coast. In the 1990s, fog collecting devices were set up in the Namib Desert. These are primitive, simple affairs, but they work, and the water collected can be very good quality. Some innovative thinkers believe the best way to overcome our water shortage is to move water from where it's plentiful to where it's scarce. Prince Mohammed Al Faisal, for example, thought he had a wonderful idea. Lasso icebergs in Antarctica that contain as much as 100 million tons of fresh water and tow them to the thirsty people of Saudi Arabia.
They studied this quite extensively and decided and discovered to their satisfaction or dissatisfaction that they would really never be able to get an iceberg across the equator. It would simply melt before it got there. They did go so far as to tow a large chunk of ice around San Francisco Bay for a while, but yes, indeed, it melted, and so they sort of gave up the study. And then there's the other scheme, which is popular in industrial countries, of using decommissioned oil tankers, refitting them for use as bulk water carriers. Problem was, when they started to cost it out, these are really big vessels. They're 30,000, 40,000, 60,000 metric tons. They're very expensive to clean. The best estimate that we came up with was that it would cost around $5 million per vessel simply to get it up to standard for carrying potable water. And even then, they weren't really sure that they'd be clean.
Calgary's James Cran has devised another method to transport water from here to there in a much cheaper way. Again, it's about towing fresh water through the sea, using gigantic bags.
We call these bags Medusa bags. And the reason for that is that all the interest that we had was from Mediterranean countries. And in all the Mediterranean languages, a jellyfish is called a medusa. We use that name because our bags are great big, let me call them soft, floppy things that just flow with the waves, as does a jellyfish. Because it's fresh water in salt water, it floats, no problem. 97.5% is underneath, and then there's this little bit at the top. Environmentally, the bags, of course, are extremely benign. If, unfortunately, a bag were to rip open, its contents is fresh water, which would be released over the surface of the sea, and it's the same as having a good thunder shower.
Years of research and testing finally produced a Medusa bag made from a thin, flexible polyester fabric coated with vinyl. It's the weight of window shears, floats well, and pulling it through the sea uses a minimum amount of energy.
The smallest that we would consider for economic reasons is containing 300,000 tons of water, or 300,000 cubic meters. And that's the size of a supertanker. Now that's a small bag, okay? The big bag is like 1.5 to 2 million tons and is the size of, well, 6 supertankers and twice as long and twice as wide. The bag, the size of a supertanker, costs about $4 million, and a supertanker is $80 million. So right away, it's 20 times more expensive.
The tricky question, of course, is where will the fresh water to fill the Medusa bags come from? The have and have-not nations are not always on the friendliest terms. So far, it's politics that have prevented the Medusa bag from becoming a reality. Israel has studied Cran's Medusa bag and determined it was 20 times less costly than desalination. They also found a ready supply of fresh water, just 600 kilometers away in Turkey. It all seemed promising until politics got in the way.
When we looked at this with the Israelis, their engineers, they decided that it was, in fact, the best solution for bringing more water to Israel, politics aside. Now, we got actually somehow into the press, and the Arab countries heard that this study was going on, and they descended on Turgut Özal, the president of Turkey, and said, "No way are you going to supply water to Israel." And so he was forced to tell the Israelis, "I'm sorry, we can't supply you."
These days, the Medusa bag lies as flat as a jellyfish on land, waiting for the right political environment and an investor with $5 million.
And so it just sits there. It's in the venture capital world, and by the way, there's no adventure in venture capital. It's called the living dead, one of the living dead.
While inventors devise new techniques to try and fix our water shortage, in reality, it's ordinary people, you and me, who could be doing a lot more to solve the world's water woes. Living in the desert can be as difficult as it gets. Historically, it has often meant a life of bare necessities, of making do. But there are places that can afford to bring water to the desert. Tucson, Arizona is one of these places.
Tucson, until very recently, has been 100% dependent on groundwater, and we have been using water in an unsustainable fashion. There were new technological developments in terms of wells, motors, energy supplies to run pumps and the like. Here in Tucson, everywhere you turn, there's a new housing development. The population of the valley is over 900,000 now, a tremendous increase, and it shows no signs of letting up. Think of an aquifer as a giant milkshake glass, and think of each well as a straw in the glass. The law in most American states permits a limitless number of straws to suck from that finite resource. Well, that's a recipe for disaster.
Despite these criticisms, Tucson is doing a much better job of conserving water than most other desert communities in the U.S. This thanks in large part to a method of landscaping called xeriscaping.
The term xeriscape is commonly used, referred to as xeriscape, and xeriscape is not what we want. We jokingly refer to as xeriscape as the property that puts a bunch of rock and some cactus on their front yard. And that's not really good because here in the desert, what it does is creates a lot of heat in the summertime. The true pronunciation of the word is xeriscape. It comes from the Greek root xeris, or xeric, referring to dry. The main principles of xeriscape involve the use of native plants because they can sustain themselves primarily on the natural precipitation that the region might have. Mesquite trees are very commonly used here. We have a lot of different variety of cactus. In this particular one, we see some prickly pear, and we also see a saguaro in the background as well. I think one of the things that we've been very successful at in Tucson here is getting people to accept the fact that this is a desert community. And since the 1960s and into the early 1970s, I think we've seen a big transition in the way that this community looks. It really does look more like a desert community because people have accepted this desert landscape concept.
Over the last 30 years, the consumption of water per household in Tucson has decreased by 30% with the help of xeriscaping. Each household uses 160 gallons a day compared with their upstate cousins in Phoenix, where the usage is 280 gallons per household per day, or in Las Vegas, where residents use almost twice as much water per day as the people of Tucson. Nevertheless, with population booming, the city's groundwater has fallen drastically.
Groundwater in the United States has become a very important supply. It once only serviced a few people from shallow wells, but groundwater, we now pump 27 trillion gallons of groundwater a year. Groundwater now supplies over half of the population of the United States with its drinking water.
Groundwater is held in the spaces between the particles of soil. And as you pump that water out, it's replaced with air in most cases. But when you're pumping from areas that are heavy in clay and silt, those particles close up and can close up permanently. That permanently damages your ability to store water underground as groundwater. Those spaces are gone forever.
Faced with a severe water shortage, Tucson had to be very innovative, very resourceful. The use of recharge basins was its answer.
Water from the Colorado River, about 335 miles away from here, is put onto the ground in basins, allowed to percolate down and mix with the naturally occurring groundwater beneath. And from there, the blend is taken, pumped out, and delivered to customers of Tucson Water. Because we can use that resource, we don't have to pump as much groundwater to meet the needs of customers. So we're talking about a lot of water, millions and millions of gallons, that is sinking into the earth in this basin alone, and we have 10 other basins of similar size. So we're talking a lot of water. Something like 45 billion gallons of water a year will be recharged or allowed to percolate into the earth at this facility. Tucson Water has monitored groundwater levels for decades, and we've seen groundwater levels drop as much as 250 feet in some areas. Since we've been operating this project, beginning in mid-2001, we've seen levels in those areas start to recover after decades of falling, primarily because we've been able to turn wells off in that area and use this water resource instead.
While the Tucson recharge basins are huge, expensive, and technically complex, the principle by which they operate is not so far away from an ancient tradition in China. In the dry mountain area of Shaanxi, there is not enough farmland and too little moisture. When it does rain, the water quickly runs off. Farmers here have dealt with these difficult conditions by following the methods of their forefathers.
这原来在很早以前，这都是荒山，就是说是自古来说就是车规矩。
A long time ago, all of this was just a wild, dry mountain area. Our ancestors created terraces. Some pieces are bigger and some are smaller.
小块的，还有大块的，还有小块的，还有力能更重的，还有就是。
They were all man-made, all those steps. It helped to maintain the soil so that it didn't wash away. The flatness also helped to keep the rain on the ground. With more water on the ground, the plants grew better. Every year during the dry season, there'd be no rain for more than 40 days. That's why we said that what we ate depended on the God of heaven. From 1984 to 1996, we began to build terraces on a much bigger scale. See all this? All different shapes and sizes, and they're all terraces now. Why are we building terraces? To change our life and increase our income. People can make things happen, and we want to use every single piece of land that is available to us.
The Chinese have long been great conservers of water. Countries around the world have adapted their agricultural practices. Even Riverside, California, famous for its citrus orchards, borrowed irrigation methods from the Chinese.
By the late 19th century, there are probably in the neighborhood of 100,000 Chinese workers in all of Southern California working the groves and working in packing houses. And their expertise on how to grow citrus made Riverside very, very successful because these growers understood that they could help them a great deal, and they implemented their information. They understood how to create ditches to divert water as well as to use those ditches for watering their trees. It very soon became known as the Riverside method of irrigation because the growers renamed it. Once they learned how to do it from their Chinese employees, they renamed it the Riverside method and helped build up their image of Riverside as the home of the commercial citrus industry. Southern California is a really, really wealthy region of the world. Citrus had a lot to do with it.
But along with California's wealth came a booming population and a lot of problems. Housing development everywhere, pollution, overcrowding, and frightening water shortages. Something had to be done to ensure enough drinking water for the 15 million people who now live in Southern California. the innovators are turning their eye to the ocean. Most of the water on Earth, 97%, is salt water. Water we can't drink, water we can't use to nourish our crops. A lot of thinking and a lot of effort have gone into figuring out the best way to make salt water usable. Bowie Kiefer is one of those innovators. He is a Canadian scientist who has devised a small, portable desalination device. Stranded mariners have been grateful for Kiefer's invention. It has saved their lives.
People were using our desalinators for long-distance sailing, and one couple decided to treat themselves to the adventure of a trip around the world. A month into the trip, they had an adventure which started off very enjoyably with whales coming up around the yacht at dusk. And it was very exciting and very enjoyable until suddenly there was a great lurching shock and the boat listed over and rapidly sank. They were in the life raft where they stayed for 55 days. And that part of the adventure was less enjoyable, but they survived. They had fishing hooks and they had one of our manually operated desalinators, and they pumped their own fresh water out of the sea.
In Carlsbad, California, an amazing construction project is underway. A desalination plant that will produce 50 million gallons of fresh, salt-free water per day.
The tank behind me holds 5 million gallons. So if you can imagine, we'll fill that tank behind me 10 times per day, 365 days a year, and that supply will be shipped into the interior parts of San Diego County for drinking water purposes, commercial use, industrial use, and so on. We're at a point now where the seawater desalination technology has become affordable when we compare it to other supply options, and it's something that we can do that's now cost-effective, and we're able to deploy it in a fashion that's environmentally friendly. And I think if you look out 50 years, possibly 100 years, I think you'll find yourself in a situation where the coastal regions of California are receiving most, if not all, of their water supply from the ocean.
For some places in the world, desalination means more than just fresh water. It's a way to alleviate political tensions as well. Singapore is a lush, semi-tropical country with over 4 million people, one of the most densely populated areas in the world. It has no freshwater resources of its own. It must import all of its water from Malaysia through huge pipelines across this border bridge. Political differences could easily end with the tap being turned off. To enhance its sovereignty, Singapore considered building water desalination plants, although the cost was thought to be much too high. After extensive study and with the help of newer technologies, it turned out to everybody's surprise that desalination was less expensive than buying water from Malaysia. Singapore made the leap and now plans to build 6 such plants. There are now more than 21,000 desalination plants in the world. Together, they produce more than 30 billion liters of fresh water a day.
There are 2 problems with desalination. The first is it's extremely expensive. The filters to do that are very high-tech and expensive, and it takes a lot of energy to push the salty water through the filters, leaving the salt on this side and getting the potable water on the other side. The second problem is, what do you do with the water on this side that's very saline? You need to get rid of it someplace, and trying to find a disposal creates a serious environmental problem.
Let desalination compete on an equal footing with conservation and efficiency. And if that happens, I think we'll see desalination postponed for quite some time into the future.
Like everything we do to solve our current water predicament, there are consequences that may come back to haunt us. perhaps the best thing is to put more value on what we already have and just use water more wisely. When you look at the glittering city of Las Vegas, Nevada, a lot of things come to mind, but a desert is probably not one of them. Las Vegas is a lush, green, dazzling city which receives on the average only 3 inches of rain annually. Yet it thrives in defiance of the bareness that surrounds it. As much as its gambling palaces, this tourist mecca is famous for its emerald green golf courses.
Right now there's approximately 50 golf courses in the Las Vegas metropolitan area that use a lot of water, roughly 1 million gallons a day in the summertime apiece. The reason golf is so expensive in Las Vegas and anywhere I think in the Southwest is because you have to pay for the water. Our average golf course here in Vegas, their annual water bill is well over $1 million.
50 beautifully manicured golf courses might seem profligate even for Las Vegas if it weren't for the fact that the irrigation water is recycled water. The Northwest Water Resource Center treats 10 million gallons of used water a day. This water is only for irrigating golf courses.
We get all our influent water from the area of town directly to the west of our plant, which the way the valley is shaped, it all goes uphill from here. The water comes in from the regular collection system into our plant.
And Las Vegas's most famous trademark, the hotels and gambling casinos, are doing their bit to conserve water too.
And a lot of those hotels are plumbed 2 different ways. The toilets and such go to our sanitary sewer system, but what they call the gray water, the sinks, showers, and all that stuff, they actually have small treatment plants on their site. They will treat their own water and reuse it in the water features, irrigation, and things like that. So they're being good stewards of water, as we call it.
Everybody's got to do their part to conserve. The golf courses have started the ball rolling with the water budget and trying to conserve. We use the reclaimed, the reuse water to irrigate with. I think that combined with awareness for not only the golf courses, but also the homeowners to shut their sprinkler clocks off when it's raining outside as a starter. I think with all that combined, I think we'll be able to save enough water to survive here in the desert.
The prize for the most successful and efficient water management goes not to affluent North America, but far away to the African nation of Namibia. Windhoek is the capital city of Namibia and is the home to more than 1 in 5 Namibians. The city is also famously thrifty with water. Las Vegas, another desert capital, uses 3 times as much water per capita as Windhoek does. Windhoek is, in fact, the only city in the world to fully recycle all of its wastewater, including sewage, into drinking water. This plant has a capacity of 8 million cubic meters a year, a very substantial proportion of the total consumption of the city. The need is so great here, there is little debate about drinking former toilet water. Is this water safe? Yes, it is. This is possibly the most monitored and scrutinized water anywhere in the world. China is a vast country that has also come to value every drop of its precious resource. In China, 80% of the water is used for agricultural purposes. With its 1.3 billion people and major rivers drying up every year, the country is facing great challenges. With its fast-growing economy and ever-increasing human activity, China's environment has been severely damaged.
50 years ago, there were only 137 cities in China. Now, there are 667 major cities. Water scarcity in our country is very serious. According to official statistics, of the 667 major cities, more than 400 are facing water shortages.
Saving the environment has become a national crusade. Reforestation is one of the tools being used to recover sustainability. 400 years ago, 24% of China was covered by forest. By the middle of the 20th century, that number had dropped to a shocking 9%. Deforestation is a major cause of China's water struggles.
We all know that forests play a very important role in the world's ecosystem. They stabilize the soil and keep the moisture in the ground to prevent runoffs. They also keep nutrients in the water and help cleanse it. After much study, the central government introduced a new environmental protection plan, which we call the 16-character policy. Transform the farmland back to forest. Feed those farmers so they can retire. Return the forests to the mountains.
I began working with the reforestation project here when I was 21. It's been more than 37 years already. I'm 59 now. This is the border of Mao Wusu Desert and the Loess Plateau. As we saw on our way here, we can still see some exposed earth, but mostly there's sand. Without trees to stop the wind, the soil is just blown away. This portion of the Great Wall was built about 500 years ago during the Ming Dynasty. According to historical documents, where we are now, Yulin, was once rich in water and soil. These changes came about for a number of reasons. The first was war. This part of the Great Wall was a frontier region. It was a military area, and there were hostilities here. Then, human migration led to the cultivation of the land, and as the population grew, trees were cut down and forests were destroyed. Massive reforestation began in 1978. It was called the Three Fences of the Northern Forest Project. You see, before that, we only worked in smaller areas because we lacked funding. But after 1978, the government decided to fund this project, and we were able to cover much larger areas. We covered them with trees and shrubs and grasses, all types of vegetation. If you look in the north, you'll see rows and rows of poplar trees. Those are the groves that we planted. The idea was the grass would stabilize the sand and the trees would block the strong winds. Collectively, these trees have helped maintain the water and the soil. They also preserve the watershed. Now we're finding that a variety of wild animals in the desert have returned, like the dog badger. It had all but disappeared before, and now we're seeing them in the woods quite often. Many of the birds have come back to the woods as well.
Reforestation is simply one way to return to a healthier environment of the past. All over the world, people are looking back to a time when our water was more plentiful and pollution was practically unheard of.
Now, in the farm I grew up in, every morning when I sat down at the table, I had to drink fresh milk from the cow. And I had to have fresh butter. We didn't have any refrigeration. We couldn't keep this stuff from spoiling or going sour. We had running water on the farm. Mother handed me the pail and said, Elmer, run down to the well and get a pail of water. We had a windmill, and it was pumped out of a deep well, and it was a good quality water. There wasn't any pollutants in it.
Elmer Laird has been an organic farmer for 40 years. He chose not to use chemicals on his crops that can pollute the soil and the water.
Back in those days, we relied on our senses, you know, our sense of smell and our sense of taste and the senses. But the senses don't work for us now, because this could be quite polluted and I wouldn't be able to taste it.
These days, Elmer Laird still must haul his drinking water in buckets in the back of his truck. Water is vital to every aspect of our lives. And yet we humans have settled on parts of the planet so dry it could not possibly meet our needs. We have cultivated this arid earth and in the process have done great harm to the environment. The grasslands of southern Saskatchewan are an example. In the 1850s, surveyor John Palliser declared this area was simply too dry to grow wheat.
Well, this is pretty well the heart of the Palliser Triangle area. It's usually quite dry. It's not a heavy rainfall area, but the last few years we've had more than normal, but generally speaking, it's fairly arid down here.
The Canadian government ignored Palliser's advice and in the early 20th century opened the drylands to homesteaders. Peter Butala's father and uncles, immigrants from Slovakia, settled near East End, Saskatchewan.
Yeah, there was a lot of heartbreaks there was tremendous sad stories of homesteaders trying to make a go. There's no water and no wood and poor prices and grasshoppers and you name it, and hailstorms, and yeah, there was terrific suffering.
It's a harsh environment. Doesn't matter how physically beautiful it might be. It's a very difficult place to live. It's hard on you. The openness means wind. Then on top of that, the dryness. Sometimes the ground cracks, it's so dry, and you can't move without stirring up dust.
Peter's family quickly gave up wheat farming and took up cattle ranching. But, encouraged by faulty government policies, other farmers still try to grow grain crops, even though there is little rain and the soil is poor.
And a lot of the land, even the people that broke it, knew they shouldn't do it, but it was with our systems of crop insurance and cheap freight and all the incentives to grow wheat that the land did get broke up for quotas or whatever reason. There was ways of working the system that you could make it pay, and that's what they did.
And along with cultivation came the use of pesticides and herbicides.
You know, I've heard of reports where people have pumped water out of their dugouts to water the gardens, and it kills all the garden off, because there's so many chemicals just blew off their, runoff. It really scared them, They couldn't, and then they were using this water for their own purposes,
As Peter Butala neared retirement age, he worried that his land, which he had kept rich with natural grasses, would fall victim to the plow.
Going back over the years, I'd get on a high hill and look over the horizon and try and think of what it might have looked like, before the Europeans got here. And I kind of throw out crazy ideas, which I sometimes do, and I said, well, I should turn this whole southwest corner of Saskatchewan into a huge Serengeti and just let the buffalo and the elk and the antelope, and if you want tours going through, there's plenty of infrastructure for that.
In 1996, Peter and Sharon Butala decided that there was only one way to deal with the problem of so little rainfall: return the land to its natural state. The Butalas donated nearly 13,000 acres of their land to create the Old Man on His Back Conservation Area, a sanctuary of natural prairie grasses and all kinds of wildlife. Then, in 2003, 50 head of young bison were let loose in this vast natural pasture. It was a return to the home of their ancestors.
The buffalo can go a lot further for a drink of water if it has to. 4 or 5 miles, it wouldn't mean anything to them. They'd just get up and gallop away, and, and they'd get there. And we don't even know how much they drink. They may not need as much water. We don't know how long they lay around the water holes, or we just don't know how that animal functions in its systems. They've been here for 10,000 years or better, and they are the natural grazers.
I see it as very careful, well thought out, scientific attempt to see what we can learn from trying to do things at least to some degree the way it used to be before we came. And I think there's a part of us that dreams of what this place was that none of us ever saw, that looks at those bison out on their homeland, and this thing happens where you feel such delight and awe and a kind of a satisfaction. This is how it was, this is how it should be.
I grew up in the vast, dry expanse of the South African plains. It was called the Thirstland. My grandfather was a farmer here, and he built an earthen dam to corral the rainwater. But for years the rains didn't come, and the dam began to shrink. His crops shriveled, and his animals starved. Eventually he was forced to eliminate his herd by shooting them in the field. When the rains did come, it was in violent cloudbursts, and the torrents of water ripped the dam apart. My grandfather's hopes were all but washed away with the dam itself. Near the end of his life, I watched my desperate grandfather drill a well deep into the earth. He was able to coax from it enough water to save his drought-stricken farm. Water, the idea of water, the longing for water, consumed his life, and well it should have. And yet, all around the world, the battle rages on. More and more people are consumed by a never-ending struggle for water.
Well, water is fundamental to everything we care about. It's fundamental to the way we live, to the ecosystems that sustain us. It's critical for the food that we have to grow to meet our food needs. It's fundamental to industrial production.
There is tremendous demand on a finite resource, and that being water. And what we need to do is to break this relentless cycle of overuse of the resource. We need to recognize that the resource is in fact finite, which it is.
There is enough water on the planet for everyone to have clean, fresh water for their basic needs, so that they can make a cup of tea or a cup of coffee in the morning with water that doesn't make them sick. But not everyone on the planet has that clean, fresh water at the moment. I think one of the most fundamental challenges facing us in the 21st century is ensuring that enough basic fresh water is available for every human on the planet.
The relationship between water and humanity is changing constantly, and so the full story, the true story of water, can never be definitively told. It is being written daily by all of us.